When John Wayne leaned back in his chair, everyone in the studio relaxed for a moment. The Wayne they knew was coming. Tough, blunt, uncompromising. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show set felt quieter than usual on that gloomy autumn night of 1971. The audience had come to see Duke, the man who'd taken off the cowboy hat but never dropped the stance. Carson eased through the first few minutes. A Western anecdote, a laugh, a few classic Wayne one-liners, but then the subject changed. A name dropped into the conversation, a name that still made Hollywood uneasy just to hear. A director who'd been blacklisted, whose career had been shattered to pieces, and something broke in that studio. The expression on Wayne's face shifted. Those steel-cold eyes everyone recognized gave way to something else, something no one expected. Carson noticed. The audience noticed. Even the cameraman tightened his frame, because John Wayne was about to say something that no one expected from John Wayne. And the words spoken that night would echo in people's minds for decades to come. To grasp this moment, you have to travel back in time. Not just to that night, but to who Wayne was, or more precisely, to who America believed he was. Marion Robert Morrison was born in 1907 in the small town of Winterset, Iowa. His father was a pharmacist, his mother a homemaker, and the family never lived comfortably. When they moved to Glendale, California, young Marion walked to school every day alongside a big Airedale Terrier. The neighborhood kids called the dog Little Duke, and its owner Big Duke. The name stuck. Marion Morrison died, and Duke was born. And when Duke eventually became John Wayne, he never showed anyone the fragile boy he'd left behind. By the late 1940s, Wayne wasn't just an actor, he was a symbol. He hadn't served in World War II. Health issues and studio contracts had kept him off the front lines, but on screen, he was the war's greatest hero. This contradiction ate at him from the inside. The men who'd actually gone to the front had come back, some with missing limbs, some with hollow stares. Wayne, meanwhile, had been waving the American flag behind fake sandbags on a studio lot. Maybe that's why he chose a different war. The war against communism. In that war, at least, he could actually be on the front line. In 1949, he took over the presidency of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. The name itself was a manifesto. Wayne positioned himself as a sentinel, tasked with purging the Red Menace from within Hollywood. When Congress's House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, reached into Hollywood, Wayne was in the front ranks. He testified. He named names. He endorsed it all. When the Blacklist took shape, Wayne called it a necessary price. If you love this country, you can't turn a blind eye to the people trying to tear it down, he'd said in an interview, without squinting, without a tremor in his voice. But the real face of the Blacklist looked nothing like the picture Wayne painted at press conferences. Screenwriters lost their jobs overnight. Directors fled the country. Dalton Trumbo, one of Hollywood's most brilliant writers, was forced to write scripts under fake names. During the 10 years he couldn't use his own name, he won 2 Oscars, and someone else collected both. Ring Lardner Jr. went to prison. Edward Dmytryk went into exile. Most of these people's only crime was attending a meeting. Some had genuinely been members of the Communist Party, some were just curious, and some had simply been sitting in the wrong room at the wrong time. Wayne knew all of this. He'd had to look them in the face. They'd eaten in the same studio cafeterias, worked on the same sets. Some of them had sat at the same poker table. Years later, in a letter Wayne reportedly wrote to his close friend and director John Ford, he used a sentence that went something like this: "I know I did the right thing, but some nights doing the right thing isn't enough to let me rest my head on the pillow." Ford kept that letter for the rest of his life. By 1971, the world had changed. The Vietnam War had split America clean down the middle, and Wayne, with his 1968 film The Green Berets, had become one of the war's loudest advocates. On university campuses, Wayne posters were being burned. The younger generation saw him as a relic of the past, but Wayne didn't care, or so it seemed. He was 64 years old. In 1964, he'd lost his left lung. After the cancer surgery, he'd announced, "I licked the big C." But in reality, he suffered from shortness of breath, needed an oxygen mask during long scenes, and only those closest to him knew it. That autumn, Wayne's appearance on The Tonight Show was a strategic move for both sides. Carson's show was America's nightly gathering point. An estimated 15 million people tuned in every night. For Wayne, it was a chance to speak to a new generation. For Carson, a name like Wayne always meant ratings, but Carson had a different plan in mind for that night. Carson appeared to be a laid-back, improvisational host, but in reality, he was a professional who meticulously prepared every episode. His producers had lined up topics Wayne would be comfortable with for that evening: his new film, his love of horses, maybe a few political jokes. But among the cards on Carson's desk, there was one question he hadn't shown his producers. The show's head producer Fred de Cordova once described that period. "Johnny sometimes wouldn't tell us. You know, there were questions he wanted to save for the moment." The Wayne night was one of those nights. We don't know exactly what Carson wrote on that card, but what we do know is this: it was about a director who'd been blacklisted and whose career had been destroyed. And Carson was preparing to ask this question on live television in front of 15 million people to America's most unyielding conservative. On the day of the broadcast, the NBC studios in Burbank were running at their usual pace. Makeup rooms were full. The smell of coffee drifted through the corridors. The technical crew was adjusting lights. Wayne arrived at the studio earlier than usual. An assistant who saw him backstage described that day like this: "Normally he'd come in, joke around with everyone, fill the room. That day he was quiet. He was sitting in a corner, a glass of water in his hand, staring out the window. He had this look about him that was nothing like Wayne." Carson, meanwhile, was in his office making final preparations. He was shuffling the cards on his desk, pulling some out, adding others. When Ed McMahon stopped by Carson's office that day, he later recalled that Carson had said, "Tonight's going to be interesting," and nothing beyond that. At 11:30 p.m., The Tonight Show's theme music played. Ed McMahon's "Here's Johnny" filled the studio. Carson walked on stage, delivered his monologue, cracked a few topical jokes. The first guest came and went, and then it was Wayne's turn. When Duke walked on stage, the applause didn't stop quickly. The audience rose to their feet. Wayne could still command that effect. He sat down, crossed his legs, flashed that familiar wide grin. The first few minutes went exactly as everyone expected. They talked about his new film. Wayne told a cowboy story. The audience laughed. Carson asked a question. Wayne answered in that familiar deep voice. Everything was going according to script, but Carson still had that card in his hand. About 15 minutes in, maybe 20, Carson steered the conversation toward Hollywood's history, the golden age, the studio system, the old days. Wayne was sharing his memories comfortably. The conversation flowed naturally. Nothing felt forced. And then Carson, as if asking an ordinary question, said the name of the blacklisted director. The atmosphere in the studio changed instantly. A brief murmur rose from the audience and was immediately cut short. Orchestra leader Doc Severinsen set down his pen and looked at the stage. One of the cameramen tightened the frame on Wayne's face. Wayne's smile faded, not immediately. Slowly, the corners of his lips dropped first, then his jaw tightened slightly. He set his coffee cup down on the table slowly. His fingers lingered on the handle a moment too long, as if he needed something to hold on to. Carson waited. He knew how to do this. When he felt the weight of the question he'd asked, his best weapon was silence. He didn't turn to the audience, didn't crack a joke, didn't change the subject. He just looked at Wayne, and Wayne began to speak. But the sentence he started with was one nobody expected. Wayne began and stopped. The fact that he stopped was an event in itself. John Wayne didn't pause. John Wayne always knew his line. On set and off. He'd recite his lines from memory, tell directors don't tell me what to say, and live his life with steps far more certain than any script. But that night, sitting across from Carson, he stopped mid-sentence. The audience wasn't moving. A woman in the front row was clutching her purse in her lap. Someone in the back rows coughed and immediately went silent, as if suddenly aware of a taboo. Wayne lowered his head slightly, just an inch, maybe two. But seeing Wayne lower his head, this wasn't a sight the audience was accustomed to. He placed his hand on his knee, his fingers curling slightly. "Listen, Johnny," he said finally. His voice was still deep, but that familiar steel edge was gone. Something drier, more bare had taken its place. "I love this country. You know that. Everyone knows that. And I believe communism is a threat to this country. You know that too. I haven't changed my mind on that. And I won't." Carson nodded. He said nothing. This was Carson at his most powerful, a man who understood that silence could say more than words. Wayne continued, "But let me also say this." And here he paused again. It was impossible not to notice this second pause. A ripple went through the audience. Everyone was thinking the same thing. What is Duke going to say? For a man or a woman to be driven from their job, from their livelihood, to have their life destroyed just because of the ideas in their head. Wayne's voice dropped here. Not quite to a whisper, but it dropped. "I don't think that's right. I never quite thought it was right." The studio sank into silence. Completely. From the orchestra pit, from the control room, from the audience seats, not a sound. As if someone had turned off the building's volume switch. The expression on Carson's face didn't change. He didn't raise his eyebrows, didn't narrow his eyes, didn't show surprise. This was a deliberate choice. Carson was too smart to diminish the magnitude of the moment by exaggerating it. He simply leaned forward slightly, as if to say, "Go on," but without using the words. Wayne reached for his cup, took a sip. His hand wasn't entirely steady. Saying it was trembling would be an exaggeration, but that absolute control, that usual granite solidity wasn't there. When he set the cup down, it clinked lightly against the saucer. "There were people," Wayne said, speaking more slowly now, choosing his words. "Good people, good artists too. And one morning they woke up and everything was gone because their names were on a list. Maybe they'd gone to a meeting, maybe they'd read the wrong book, maybe they'd shaken the wrong person's hand." Carson spoke for the first time, "And you supported that list." The sentence cut through the studio like a knife. Carson hadn't said it as an accusation. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words themselves were sharp enough. Wayne looked Carson straight in the eyes. A long moment. On screen, this look might have lasted a second or two, but for those in the studio it felt much longer. Years later, a sound technician who'd been on set that night put it this way: "I saw something in Wayne's eyes. Regret, anger, exhaustion. I'm still not sure, but in that moment, there was something on his face that I'd never seen in any of his movies." "Yes," Wayne said. One word. "Yes." And for a while, he said nothing else. Then he took a deep breath. His chest expanded as far as it visibly could. For a man who was missing one of his lungs, that breath must have been slightly painful, but he didn't let it show on his face. "I supported it, and I'm still saying destroying a person because of their thoughts is not right. I can say both things at the same time, because both are true." At this point, Carson did something very subtle. The corner of his lips moved. It wasn't a smile, more of an expression of acceptance, as if he understood how difficult it was for the man sitting across from him to say this contradiction out loud. And Carson didn't exploit the moment. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He didn't say, "Then why did you support it?" He didn't say, "Isn't that a contradiction?" After just a brief moment, he simply nodded. That silence, the space Carson left, made the scene heavier than it already was, because the audience filled that space with their own thoughts. Everyone drew their own conclusion. Some were angry at Wayne. You supported it, and now your conscience is bothering you. Some felt respect. At least he could say it. Some were left confused, which was perhaps the most honest reaction of all. Wayne noticed Carson's gesture. He was a man who'd spent a lifetime on screen. He could instantly tell when a host was cornering him and when a host was giving him room. Carson had given him room, and Wayne knew it. "Johnny," Wayne said, his voice now returning to a slightly more familiar tone, but not entirely. "This was never easy. It wasn't easy for any of us, but some nights you think, was I on the right side? And most nights you believe the answer is yes. But some nights," he didn't finish the sentence. John Wayne on live television, in front of millions, left a sentence unfinished, and that half-spoken sentence was more powerful than any complete one could have been. But the real story of that night begins after the cameras stopped rolling. What Wayne said that night, while shocking to the studio audience, wasn't a complete surprise to those who knew him closely, because between Duke's public face and his private one, there had been a quiet crack that had been widening for years. In the mid-1950s, during the darkest days of the Blacklist, director Edward Dmytryk had been nearly erased from Hollywood entirely. He was a member of the group known as the Hollywood 10, and after getting out of prison, he couldn't knock on any studio door. A phone call Dmytryk received during that period remained secret for years. The caller wasn't Wayne directly. Wayne would never have done it that openly. But someone from Wayne's inner circle had arranged a meeting for Dmytryk with a producer. Dmytryk ultimately got off the list by testifying before UAC. That was his own decision. But whispers that Wayne's fingerprints were on that first door being cracked open circulated through Hollywood's corridors for years. There's another incident. Screenwriter Carl Foreman, the writer of High Noon, blacklisted and forced to emigrate to England, shared a surprising detail in an interview years later. Before leaving Hollywood, Foreman had received an unexpected message sent through a mutual acquaintance of Wayne's. "We won't agree on politics, but I always admired your scripts. If you leave, this industry loses." Foreman never confirmed the authenticity of this message 100%, but he added, "The thing between me and Wayne was never personal. He knew that, and so did I." These details cast Wayne's words on Carson in a different light. Maybe he wasn't speaking for the first time that night. He was speaking for the first time out loud, on camera, to millions. For the first time he was laying bare, without hiding it, the contradiction he'd been carrying for years. The system was right, but some of its costs were wrong. And perhaps the most striking detail was this: Wayne didn't stop defending the Blacklist that night. He didn't soften his stance against communism. He didn't step back from his beliefs. But he drew a line: the price of ideas should not be the destruction of a person's life. This subtle distinction, holding on to your ideology while standing up at the point where that ideology crushes people, elevated Wayne beyond a simple portrait of right-wing hero or belated conscience. Director Peter Bogdanovich shared that in one of his final conversations with Wayne, this subject had come up. When Duke talked about this, his voice would change. He wouldn't get defensive, and he wouldn't get aggressive. He'd just get tired. As if he was talking about the weight of something he'd been carrying on his shoulders for years. Carson changed the subject after that moment, but he didn't do it with an abrupt maneuver. It was a masterful transition, giving Wayne room to breathe. Asking about a scene from his new film, Wayne accepted the exit. Within a few sentences, his voice returned to its familiar depth. He told a cowboy story. The audience laughed. On the surface, everything had returned to normal, but it hadn't returned to normal. Everyone in the studio knew it. After the broadcast ended, Wayne went backstage. He shook a few hands as usual, posed for a few photos, but he didn't stay long that night. He turned to his assistant and simply said, "Bring the car." Normally, he'd have a drink with Carson after the show, talk about the old days. That night, Wayne didn't do that. As for Carson, when he retreated to his office, we know that producer Fred DeCordova cracked open the door and asked, "Is this airing as is?" Carson's answer was short, every second of it. The echoes of that night weren't heard immediately. In 1971, there was no social media, no concept of going viral. The next day, a few newspapers mentioned Wayne's surprising confession, but most critics brushed it off. Some wrote Wayne is softening. Others called it a belated examination of conscience. None of them were quite right, because Wayne hadn't softened. He hadn't stepped back a single inch from his beliefs. What he'd done was far harder. He'd acknowledged the pain created by a system he believed in, while continuing to be that system's advocate. This was constructing a gray sentence in a black and white world, and for a man like Wayne, it must have been harder than anything. Wayne passed away in 1979, at 72, stomach cancer. In his final years, he spoke less and less, appeared less and less. But according to those close to him, that night on Carson came back to his mind often. He once told his son Patrick, "Sometimes a man does the right thing and feels wrong. Sometimes he does the wrong thing and feels right. The hard part is accepting that both can be true at the same time." Carson, for his part, was always respectful when he spoke of Wayne, but rarely mentioned that night. Only once, in an interview with David Letterman, did he say Wayne was a brave man. But his courage that night was different from his movies. In his movies, he was always right. That night, he wasn't sure if he was right, and he still spoke. Maybe the real meaning of this story is hidden right there. Wayne didn't become a hero that night. He didn't become a confessor either. He carried a contradiction, perhaps the greatest contradiction of his life, in front of everyone for the first time. And Carson, instead of judging that contradiction, gave it room. Today, political arguments are louder than ever. Everyone picks a side, defends every argument of that side to the bitter end, and acknowledging even a single point from the other side is considered betrayal. What Wayne did that night, staying on his side while calling out his own side's wrong, is perhaps the least practiced and most needed thing of all. And sometimes, the softest sentence from the toughest man outlasts 1,000 shouted slogans. Maybe there's a moment like this in your life today. A moment when you stayed silent about something you disagreed with, or when you couldn't find the courage to say what you knew was right. Wayne found that courage as he approached 70. Maybe he was late, but he found it. If this story touched something in you, share it and subscribe, because here we tell the moments that history forgot, but that should never be forgotten.